And they were, of course, as you know from the syllabus, they're worth 5 points total, and so forth. And there was a range. There were some fives, and then everything. There were a number of fives actually, and then all the way down to except for 3. So if you are, if this is not where you're hoping to be, and you want to come and visit or email or call or set up an appointment or something like that, please let me know. I can give you more detailed feedback. But I mostly thought that you can look at what you did, and you can look at the model, look at what we went through in class on Monday, and see how they differ. But does anybody have any questions? Okay. So part of the idea is to kind of get you, with our very first problem, sort of more oriented towards where you want to be by the end of the semester when you're writing this up as a take-home, and so forth. So, but now we are turning to problem number 2, Mississippi River Basin pollution. Okay? And with problem number 2, first I want to apologize. I actually uploaded the older version of this from the last time I taught the class. So there's, when you're looking through, I think it's maybe around, maybe the second paragraph, and you're looking at something, and it's like, well, that doesn't all totally match what's on Blackboard. I apologize for that. It was the older version. So there are a couple of things that I assigned in the past that are no longer available. I assigned some material that's now available that's good, that it doesn't appear on that list, and some of the longer stuff I've actually put in a different class period. So instead of having a huge chunk of reading on the very first day, you're actually going to encounter some of those materials later. So in other words, don't worry if that didn't all match. But the rest of it's all still relatively the same. The only other thing is that from year to year, the size of the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico changes. One year it was the size of Rhode Island. This year it was the size of Massachusetts, so much larger. So just so you're like, this is New Jersey. I mean, New Jersey and Massachusetts are the same state, but yeah, I understand. It just varies from year to year. Okay. So what we're going to do now is this same kind of thing as we did when we started the grassland and prairie dog problem. Is talk about framing problem. What is the problem? What's the context? What are the issues? That sort of thing. So let's talk about that. So again, our client is
Yeah.
the Kentucky Farm Bureau. All right. So, how many of y'all have had any experience with the Kentucky Farm Bureau? Anybody have any experience? One? Really? Just a few? Okay. So, what kind of experience have y'all had? Car accident? Okay, so Kentucky Farm Bureau, right, provides insurance, right? Yes? Okay, so that's how most people, certainly most people in a law school class would know the Kentucky Farm Bureau, is because they provide insurance, right? Yes, okay, and so y'all know Andrew Schumann. He's in the field study class. He took environmental law a couple of years ago, but he actually worked for the Kentucky Farm Bureau within the insurance division and so forth. Okay, what else do they do other than provide insurance? Lobby, okay? They lobby on behalf of Kentucky Farmers, okay? So more broadly, they're an organization that provides a variety of services and support and sort of shared interest with farmers in Kentucky. The branch or the entity that lobbies on behalf of Kentucky farmers is actually the Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation. That is legally a separate entity from their insurance operations, and it's also legally a separate entity from many of their sort of membership support services of a nonprofit nature. Anybody know why? Anybody know why they have to have a separate foundation federation, a separate federation to do the lobbying?
Political contributions.
Okay.
And the way their entire system's set up, because as a lobbyist, you have to report all of your expenditures.
Exactly. Yeah, it's in part lobbying laws, and it's in part the tax code, right? So this is an issue, and I just want to flag this because whether you go work for Kentucky Farm Bureau, whether you go work for the National Association of Manufacturers, whether you go work for the Sierra Club, Environmental Defense Fund, Advocates for the Homeless, whatever organization, right? There are strict limits on nonprofit organizations in terms of the amount of political activity, including lobbying activity, that they can do. Okay? And so there are reports that have to be filed and so on and so forth. And it's not absolutely zero, but it's very limited. And so generally what happens is that if you have an organization that is relying extensively on on tax deductible contributions, right, and tax exempt status and so forth, a lot of times they'll set up separate legal entities for the lobbying part versus and political part versus the other, right? Okay, so that's part of what's going on here. All right, so Kentucky Farm Bureau, from a standpoint of environmental law generally, where's your client coming from? What's the way they look at problems like pollution in the Mississippi Basin?
Just long-term liability clients.
Okay, long-term liability to clients in what way? What's going to be the liability?
Well, specifically for the farmers that they represent, the federal agencies focus intensely on farmers to regulate their activities and limit nutrient runoff. It's going to cost more.
Okay, so so one of the sort of high-level concerns that the Kentucky Farm Bureau has is that not just about nutrient runoff generally, but rather about federal regulations to limit nutrient runoff and the extent to which that the cost of those regulations are going to be borne primarily by farmers, including and especially farmers in Kentucky, and that therefore that makes makes the cost of farming much higher, and so forth. So there's this tendency to be concerned about the increase in federal regulation that will affect farmers. Okay. Now, do you think any of that? Do you think there's any sort of broader, sort of ideological or sort of more conceptual way of thinking other than just, hey, this is going to cost our members money? And do you think that there's, the Kentucky Farm Bureau might take a more anti-regulatory stance generally? Right? Possibly? No? Yes? Maybe? Yeah.
I think it depends. If it's regulations towards actually how you use your land, then possibly, but also at
Okay.
And then I think that when it comes to like FDA and actually, what you're producing, you would actually be more pro-regulation because you want to ensure that the quality standards are in place and farmers are actually producing high-quality products and foreign products aren't affecting the quality of agriculture here.
Okay. All right. So there's some arguments that really it depends on what kind of regulations and how they affect Kentucky farmers as to whether they're pro-regulatory or anti-regulatory. Other thoughts on that? I think if you were to spend some time attending some of the meetings or going to the state fair or county fairs around and listening to people talk, I think you would find, at least in terms of kind of rank and file members, that there's a pretty good number of members who tend to be pretty skeptical of government generally, federal government in particular, and government regulation. So I think that's out there. When a few years ago I had a grant and I was doing some research on barriers to diverse participation in watershed planning and governance. And so this was, and so our focus, we had two focus areas. One was Beargrass Creek, the Beargrass Creek watershed, and the other was the Green River. Okay, and the Green River, y'all know, that runs through Mammoth Cave. It runs through a lot of South and West, South Kentucky, Southern Kentucky, and Western Kentucky, and lots of agricultural land there. So we basically had a small urban watershed and a large rural watershed, and we interviewed a bunch of people, and we were especially interested. We wanted comparisons, so we wanted people who were kind of in our target groups and people who weren't. But what we were looking at were barriers to participation by low and moderate income people, by people of color, racial and ethnic minorities, and by farmers and other agricultural producers, because in general, the data seem to show that those three groups are least likely in Kentucky to participate in watershed governance measures or watershed management measures. And so we wanted to kind of find out what sort of barriers we were coming across. And interestingly enough, in the level of government of which the interviewees were suspicious varied by watershed, but in general we saw a pattern across the board that pretty much everybody was not too keen on a governmental entity. In the case of the Green River and the farmers that we talked to, which interestingly enough, I mean, there were a number of farmers who were members of racial or ethnic minority groups. So that was an interesting thing. And actually, a number of them fell in the low to moderate income category as well. So they actually kind of hit all three categories that we were looking at. But anyway, but the general attitude across the board was they just kind of didn't like the federal government. And they were much happier if the watershed management decisions were being made by state and local governments. Okay, and interestingly enough, in the Beargrass Creek watershed, they really hated Louisville Metro government, and they really saw Louisville Metro government as not being responsive to the people and so forth, and they preferred more sort of watershed-based or neighborhood-based management. So that was kind of interesting to see. But anyway, the point was that there were some attitudes and values that didn't seem to totally match economic interests, and more had to do really with some general attitudes towards different levels of government. So I think you're going to find, I mean, I do think that you're right, that the Federation itself is going to be focused primarily on sort of what economically harms or economically benefits Kentucky farmers. But I think you're also going to find that they're going to try to be responsive to their members, some of whom have, a number of whom have sort of either anti-regulatory or anti-federal attitudes. Right? And so that's going to be part of what you're going to deal with as a lawyer for them. Okay, what other sort of outlooks does the Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation have? What else are they going to be thinking about or concerned about? Okay, so let's put it this way. If they're concerned about cost of regulation to farmers,
Isn't that a lot of Kentucky farms are not industrial size operations? There's a lot of small operations, so regulations would affect them in a stronger way than it would for a factory.
okay, good. So one of the things we got to think about is the extent to which not all agriculture really falls into the same categories. And there are significant issues that get attention in the U.S. about sort of large-scale farming. Sometimes it's called industrial farming or industrial agriculture. That doesn't mean that it's really anything like industry, really, but what it is it's large-scale, lots of use of chemicals, lots of sort of exploitation of the land to the fullest extent possible. Big companies that are kind of engaged in large-scale national and international sort of markets for food. Okay, so one of the things you can if you go to say for example Iowa or Illinois, and you look, you just drive around and see the massive cornfields, or you go to Kansas and look at the massive wheat fields, right? A lot of that is really large-scale farming by corporations. And even if you have some individual farmer or family or whatever, oftentimes anymore they really are employees or contractors or subsidiaries of some large corporate entity. Okay, so that's sort of the deal. In contrast, I mean, Kentucky has some of that. Okay, right? So there's no question. Kentucky has some of that. But at the same time, Kentucky also has a relatively high percentage of small farms, small to medium-sized farms. A number of them were tobacco farms, and then in the settlement of tobacco litigation, there was a fund set up that makes funds available to tobacco farmers to switch from tobacco to other sorts of things. Any thoughts about what the typical small farm that used to grow tobacco has switched to? Okay, one possibility is soybeans.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so hemp is a possibility really pretty recently, and so there's a little bit of that, but it's still just getting going. Cattle? Possibly, but not really, because you're talking about small scale farms. Okay? No?
Horses?
Nope. Well, that could be, but no, not really, because most of those farms aren't really in the places that are going to be best for thoroughbreds. Okay? Okay? There were, yeah.
Pumpkins?
Well, especially right now. The pumpkin spice is everything, right? Okay, right. All right. So a number of these farms in Kentucky have turned into what we call truck farms, which is really about growing produce for local markets. So all the farmers markets that you've seen develop, all of the restaurants that you go to that says we have locally grown foods, Kentucky grown or Kentucky proud or whatever, right? I mean, all that kind of stuff. So that's not everything. I mean, there's still other stuff, and some of them have been able to turn to soy or to cattle or whatever, to pumpkins or whatever. But for the most part, they're around the time that the smaller farms were getting out of tobacco, the demand for locally grown produce was growing. Okay, and Louisville, interestingly enough, was sort of one of the leaders in that. I mean, there's other parts of the country that were ahead of us and so forth, but this became a big deal, right? So, if you go eat at a restaurant in Nulu, okay, hardly any place you can go that doesn't have locally grown food on the menu, right? I mean, and that was not the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, that just was not one case.
That's what I was going to say. That's a pretty recent development.
Yep,
I think.
yep,
And if
yep.
you drive through the countryside, it's mostly, you see cornfields, soybeans, and cattle. Because we're so hilly and rocky, a lot of areas, I feel like it's a lot of pasture and stuff too.
So, but actually, all that is not most of that's not farms that have changed, right? Most of those aren't farms that were once tobacco and now suddenly are these cornfields or soybean fields or whatever, right? I mean, so anyway, so that's so the point here is that Kentucky has a broader range of agricultural products, more small-scale producers, and a broader range of different kinds of agricultural lands than, say, for example, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and so forth. Okay, why is that important? And again, I want to emphasize, it's not that we don't have corn or soybeans or cattle or whatever. We do. But my point is that it's a different kind of a different kind of agricultural base. And why is it important? Is because that many of the solutions that get sort of proposed on a national level, on a regional level, to runoff in the Mississippi River Basin are looking at all of this is coming off of these really large-scale farms in these states that are more what we call kind of monoculture kinds of farming operations. Monoculture just means one thing, right? It's one thing that they're doing, and so one of the things that happens is Kentucky farmers tend to push back against that. They tend to sort of say, "Hey, we're not Illinois, right? We don't have just miles and miles of these huge cornfields. That's not us, okay?" And so that's part of where your client is going to come from on this. On the other hand, your organization that you're representing, your client, is part of a larger network of farm bureaus nationally, right? And so at the same time, they're also going to be cooperating with other agricultural interests, other agricultural lobbying entities and so forth that are going to be saying, hey, we need to protect the big corporate corn farms in Illinois and so forth, right? So that becomes a little bit of a tricky issue for you as a lawyer for the Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation. So the other thing, and this gets back to some of the issues related to the tobacco settlement and so on and so forth. Farmers not only are concerned about the cost of regulation, but they're also, many of them, eager to receive support, right? Benefits from the government. So financial support, technical assistance, that kind of thing, right? And so that's another kind of component of this and dimension. So when I think I mentioned this a few class periods ago, but when the farmers in Kentucky speak well of the federal government, oftentimes they are referring to the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the successor to the Soil Conservation Service, which then became the Soil and Water Conservation Service and so forth. But this was the organization, the entity within the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was set up during the Dust Bowl. I mentioned, right, we talked about the Dust Bowl and so forth. But they provide a lot of financial assistance to farmers to engage in sustainable farming practices and so forth, to set aside land and not farm it for periods of time, et cetera, for conservation purposes. And they also provide a lot of technical assistance. Tell them, okay, you can do this, do that, try this, and so forth. And so every county has some sort of agent or entity that works with the NRCS. Okay? Even in Jefferson County. Jefferson County, like the rest of Kentucky, has a soil and water conservation district. Okay? So if you ever really pay close attention if you vote in Jefferson County and you pay close attention to the ballot, you will see that there are people running for the Soil and Water Conservation District Board here in Jefferson County. Okay? And actually, every year I've been, those positions on that board are very contested. There are way more candidates than there are positions. And so, not everybody, you're right, you see some of these judge races, and it's like, nobody's, the incumbent is guaranteed to be elected, right, because nobody runs for it, right, and other kinds of positions, but the Soil and Water Conservation District gets lots of candidates, so that's interesting. But anyway, the point is that there are experts at the county level that are bringing state and federal assistance to farmers to help them engage in conservation practices. Other thoughts about where your client's coming from on this problem? The flip side of not being so keen on regulation is, of course, wanting actions that are, or solutions that are voluntary, that are collaborative, cooperative, right? Okay, so that's another way of thinking about that. So you got to sort of look on it on both sides. Yes?
That's something I was going to say back to the conservation efforts and technical support. I know that there's a big issue with the extension offices that the universities run, especially UK's extension offices, that there's been funding issues throughout the last few years in the Kentucky budget.
Yep.
And that, Kentucky farmers depend on the extension offices a lot, and some have had to close, and counties are creating instead like regional counties to do their soil testing and so on, because they cannot afford extension agents for each county.
Yep, yeah, exactly. And so part of the challenge of that then is decreasing budgets, right? And the problem has been worse at the state level. So you're exactly right, Mary Grace, that as you know, as many of you know, Kentucky has a huge budget problem. This is and it's partly why your tuition keeps going up. Okay, so the law school has gotten no more money in all the. We pretty much have mostly, for the most part, the same budget as when I came here in 2005. But your tuition is way higher. Why? It's because the state support for the universities has decreased. Okay. Now there's some other things. The university spends money on other stuff that whatever. But that's a whole long conversation. But the point is that, you know, sort of across a lot of different expenditures that the state has traditionally budgeted for, there have been cuts year after year after year. And so this affects support for conservation purposes. Now, interestingly enough, in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of federal programs that looked like they were going to be eliminated due to federal budget cuts, basically federal problems with the appropriations at the federal level. And lo and behold, who steps in to fix the solution? Anybody? Any thoughts? Okay. Well, this is one where the conservationists managed to get the agricultural community all geared up and get Senator McConnell, who happens to be the majority leader, who happens to be able to make more things happen, to get this through and to get the administration to agree to these to basically restore funding to these programs in order that they don't die out. Now, the thing is, it's temporary, so they may eventually die out. Okay, so that's a whole nother sort of thing. But as you might imagine, that when you put environmental conservation and supporting farmers together, you get a much broader coalition, right, of support than just conservation by itself or just farmers by itself, right? It makes sense politically. Okay. So let's talk for a moment about about how you go about representing the Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation on this issue. So the scenario is you've got your own private law practice in Bowling Green. Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation has come to you because they're concerned about what's happening with efforts to control nutrient runoff in the Mississippi River Basin. They want to be able to shape the policies, the regulations, the laws, the solutions to this. And of course, given your impressive expertise in environmental law, you are exactly the right person to do this. How many of y'all want to go to a I'll say to a community that's not a large city to engage in private practice? How many of you want to go to private practice but somewhere other than a big city? Anybody? Anybody willing to? Some? Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. I actually kind of thought maybe more of y'all might be, that our pattern of what students do when they graduate from here suggests that, not everybody stays in Louisville or moves to New York City or Los Angeles or whatever, and people do go and work in smaller cities, towns, back to sometimes where they came from or hometown. Sometimes they make a move there, or they have some point of connection. Maybe they don't have any connection. They just decide to go there. There are other positions. There's government work. There's government attorney work. There's public interest work and so forth. So maybe some of you guys want to do that. But private practice, right, in a community like Bowling Green, lots of opportunity there, right? Yes. But you're going to have to think about, okay, who's going to be your client base? Okay. How many of y'all want to practice environmental law in private practice? So you're going to be a lawyer in private practice, and you want to practice environmental law. Anybody? What are you doing in this class? You're like, Professor Arnold, this fit my schedule. I don't know. Okay. I did that. I actually had a lot of different kinds of clients. I had government agencies, I had nonprofits, I had corporations and developers, and so a wide range of clients. I was in San Antonio, which the practice there was not too dissimilar to Louisville. So same kind of size city, same kind of size legal market, and so forth. And so that's what I did for a number of years before getting into teaching and so forth. The thing is, and actually, if you want to practice in some other field, just you have a question, which is when you go into private practice, you're going to have to, bring in revenue, right? Whether you have your own law office or you're with a firm, a big firm, a medium firm, a small firm, you have to think about what the revenue is. So you have to think about where your clients are going to come from, right? And so if you're doing private practice and your client's interests and goals maybe don't totally match yours, you're going to have to think about that. How are you going to deal with that, right? So it's something I had to think about in practice because, I was going to have a chemical company that was my client, and I had some crazy guy who traded in refrigerants. So one of the things we're not really going to get into is the CFCs and HCFCs. These are refrigerant materials that were determined ages ago, a long time ago, to be bad for the ozone layer. They were putting holes in the ozone. That was bad in a lot of ways. And so internationally, back when international agreements on the environment were possible, the nations put together what's called the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances. This is called the Montreal Protocol because it was signed in Montreal. It had a meeting, but the U.S. is a party to it. And the idea is basically it's a trading system to reduce and eventually eliminate all these CFCs and HCFCs from being manufactured and used. And the idea is it would take a while for refrigerant systems to kind of cycle out of that, for people to quit using them. So there was going to be a demand for a while. The demand was actually going to be greater in developing countries because the sort of financial capacity of those countries and their economies to switch to the new technology was not as great as it was in developed countries. And so basically there was this sort of cap, and it lowered every year, and you had to get certain credits to be able to basically trade them, say, from a developed country to a developing country. And so I had this crazy guy who did this. That was how he made his money, and it was sort of like, but of course, what he was always trying to do was skirt the law, right? I mean, so basically, here's these regulations, and so the federal government adopted these regulations, and he was always wanting to try to find some way around the regulation. So, the reality is, when you're practicing law, you have to say, okay, what are my duties to my client? Can I fairly represent them if I think, hey, this is really bad? I don't really want to see. I want to be a part of facilitating the depletion of the ozone layer. That doesn't, it's not kind of, I think I mentioned earlier when we were doing endangered species. Well, I didn't want I didn't want to be the lawyer who was the one who led to the extinction of the blind salamander in the Edwards Aquifer. That wasn't my my goal in life right? Yeah. So there used to be a Saturday Night Live skit about somebody eating the last of some endangered dragon or something like that. It was, so that was not what I wanted to do. So anyway, so you have to think about, okay, what am I? First of all, what can I do in the law office I'm in? So I was an associate. I didn't have my own private practice. I wasn't the senior partner. I didn't just get to decide this is what I'm going to do today. So I had to kind of negotiate that. but I also had to be clear with my clients what I was going to do and what I wasn't going to do. My chemical company client was great because they actually just said, tell us what we need to do and we'll do it. Okay, so they were good. A lot of times with them, I was mostly negotiating on their behalf to basically spread the cost of what they were doing out over time. So they were going to do the right thing, but they just wanted to pay for it over time. And usually I was very successful at that because they had a cash flow issue, right? Because they were small. And so people were pretty understanding about that, and I was pretty successful about negotiating that. My crazy CFC trader guy, I a lot of times had to say, nope, you can't do that, sorry. And he'd say, well, what if I did it? And I said, well, let me tell you about this part of the statute that authorizes the federal government to prosecute you and throw you in jail if you do this, right? I was sorry to say, but this is, and so that was part of kind of how that played out. But anyway, it's something that you want to think about. This works the other way too, all right? So, a lot of times people who take environmental law tend to have environmental values and kind of be more likely to want to represent, say, for example, the Kentucky Waterways Alliance, who's suing to the EPA to try to get limits on nutrient runoff. And, sometimes people are like, well, I don't know if I really want to represent the Kentucky Farm Bureau. But let me sort of flip it the other way and get you to sort of think about a scenario that I have heard from former students representing environmental groups where the environmental group is engaged, has made a bunch of choices that really are about promoting that particular group rather than what's promoting the best thing for the environment. So, for example, my former students will say, hey, it would be better if our group cooperated with a bunch of other environmental groups to advance conservation goals cooperatively. But the executive director, the boards, the staff, the head staff of those environmental groups are saying, but if we do that, then donors will contribute to those other groups as much or more than they would contribute to us. So we've got to do something, that's, where we stand out, where we are solely the ones who are doing, leading the charge, or we're the ones who are going to bring the impressive lawsuit that's going to, change environmental law and so forth, in order to claim the credit. So there's sort of credit claiming activities going on. And so then one of the issues is, if you're the lawyer for that environmental group, how comfortable do you feel about that? What kind of advice do you give? Okay, so what the organization wants, what your client wants, but at the same time you have some concerns. Okay, so I just want to raise those issues. Whatever you're comfortable with doing, whatever your goals are, in whatever practice area you go into, whether it's environmental law or some other law, you should think start thinking now about what you will not do in order to protect your career. Okay? What will you not do? What are your boundaries? What are the things where you say, no, I just can't do that? Okay, so, and again, go back to just share my personal experiences. I had a situation where we were going to get some attorney's fees from the other side. We represented one client, and they were successful, and the other side's lawsuit was really baseless, and I don't. These weren't Rule 11 sanctions, but we were awarded attorney's fees because we were clearly our position was clearly the right one legally, and the other side they never should have brought the lawsuit to begin with, and so forth. And so we're going to get the attorney's fees, and I had done a certain amount of work but some of it we had just written off because I was a young associate, and of course, obviously, I was not as efficient as if I had been more, more experienced, and so we had just written it off, and we hadn't charged the client for the full amount of my work. Well, the partner who was the lead attorney on this said that he wanted me to sign an affidavit that said, I did X amount of work, my hourly rate is Y, and so therefore we're entitled to X times Y. And I said, well, okay, but we're leaving out kind of a key fact here, which is, but we charge the client less than that, right? And it seems to me that our duty of candor and disclosure to the court requires us to state that. He's like, well, but no, we want this money. We want, and he's like, no, you need to sign this. And I said, I'm not going to sign it because it's not accurate. I mean, it's not complete. And so, basically, it was, I don't know, Friday afternoon, and I thought, okay, well, I might be packing up my office this afternoon, right? I mean, so that, yes, I had student loans, and I was like kind of not so keen on not having a job. But on the other hand, I was like, I just don't feel this is right. So I wasn't going to do it. So it actually turns out that a more senior partner kind of intervened and said, no, we've got to tell the court what we really did here. This is not good for. He agreed it wasn't right, and since he was more senior, that's what prevailed. So I kept my job. So, which is, but anyway, But the key thing I want to get across is, you need to think now, while you're still in school, while you're preparing for your career, what you feel comfortable doing and what you don't, and sort of what your ethical standards are and what your boundaries are. Okay. Yeah, I'm not saying that representing the Kentucky Farm Bureau Federation is something you should say, oh, I'm just not going to do. I mean, you might or might not, but I'm just saying you should think about that. So what are some of the context in which this problem arises? What are we talking about here? The environmental context. Let's start with that. Just describe generally the problem. It's a problem.
Increasing amounts of silt and runoff into all of the Mississippi River Basin, which is causing a big hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, so runoff, okay, and that runoff includes both nutrients and silt. That includes a lot of things, but the two big ones that we're concerned about are nutrients and silt. Those are the biggest problems. Nutrients being nitrogen and phosphorus that cause things to grow. Okay? And because they cause things to grow, that means that you get algae that grows enormously, quickly and extensively. Okay? And so you've got algae, you've got warm water, you've got sunlight, you've got nutrients. All together, that means massive algae blooms, which then suck up all the oxygen, consume all the oxygen. Maybe suck up was probably, that's not exactly what's happening. It's just, but they're consuming all the oxygen in the water. And so when we say hypoxic zone, we mean there's this phenomenon called hypoxia, which is a dead zone. There is no oxygen to support any kind of biological life. Okay? So any kind of aquatic species that's mobile moves out of the area, and any immobile aquatic species die. Okay? What about the silt? What's that about? Silt or sediment. What's going on there? Yeah.
Well, as sediment builds up, it makes the water levels a lot shallower, which requires dredging, which has its own economic costs, but it also means that coastal habitats and wetlands are disappearing because of the water levels.
Exactly, right? So it deposits along the way, and so some of it's going to be out here in the Ohio, some of it's going to be in the Mississippi. It's going to make the river shallower, not because the water levels drop, but because the bed of the river has raised, has increased. Okay, and so that requires dredging in order for boats to be able to get through the and we heard the other day in the field study class that the tonnage of shipping on the Ohio River by itself is greater than the amount of shipping that goes through the Panama Canal. Okay? Actually, the tonnage of shipping on the Ohio River is even greater than in the Mississippi River. Okay? But dredging is a frequent necessity. So the federal government does this, our U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and it's costly. It costs the federal taxpayers money in order to do this, in order to keep the shipping traffic going, but it is a huge part of our economy. Okay? So that's a piece of it. The other thing is, ecologically, you end up with wetlands, riparian zones, the shallow areas at the edge of the waterways, marshes, etc., are now being filled in. Okay? And so that is destroying those particular values, those particular habitats. One of the contributions to the enormous amount of flooding of New Orleans in Hurricane Katrina was the loss of coastal plain wetlands due to sediment deposition, the deposit of dirt and silt and sediment in these wetlands, which meant, and wetlands do a number of things, but they are nature's sponges for managing flood and storm waters and so forth. They are also nature's kidneys in that they filter out a lot of pollutants. But when they're lost due to all this soil coming down from farms in Kentucky, among other things, then we lose those services. Those are called ecosystem services, and we lose the benefits of those. Okay, and then obviously that causes tremendous amount of cost to society, to the economy, to individual people or businesses or so forth. Okay, so what's causing it? What's causing all this?
Well, it's kind of like a cumulative, I'd say it's an aggregate of all the nutrients and all the chemicals and all the pollutions that come all the way from each of the tributary rivers' headwaters.
Okay, so there is a massive geographic area that's the source of all this. Okay, so we have so the Mississippi River Basin, the greater Mississippi River Basin, which includes the upper and lower parts and so forth, goes all the way from like New York and Pennsylvania and all the way over to Montana, right? And all the way down, right? So, I mean, you can see the pictures, but the area that drains into the Mississippi River and eventually into the Gulf of Mexico is an enormous portion of our nation, okay? And it's in, so geographically, it's a huge area. So what does that mean? That means lots of different states, lots of different subbasins and watersheds that are involved. What does it mean in terms of the types of sources?
They're diverse.
Diverse, many different types of sources, such as?
Nutrient runoff from farms, direct pollution, all stormwater runoff. I mean, just
Okay.
any sort of input that you put in the ground.
Okay, all right, so farms. Farms, you have nutrients and sediment coming from what kinds of activities? Fertilizers, okay? So fertilizers are a big one. Well, what else?
Animal waste.
Animal waste, okay? All right, so any kind of livestock operation, and especially if it is a sizable one, okay? So one of the things that we'll eventually talk about is what are called CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations. These are where you see like zillions of cows or pigs or chickens or whatever all mushed into this huge scale operation. Okay, so we've got a bunch of those throughout the Mississippi River Basin, and the animals poop, and that ends up in the water eventually. Now, CAFOs are supposed to manage the waste that comes off of their operations, supposedly. Okay, but to become a CAFO, you has to be a large enough operation. The law defines that, and so you can have lots of other livestock operations that are smaller, therefore not regulated, but yet are producing quite a bit of livestock runoff. Okay. Anybody who's in the field study class, remember what I said about a surprising source of nutrients in the Floyd's Fork? Anybody remember?
When y'all were canoeing? Or
No, we weren't canoeing that.
You have the residential, all the subdivisions and everything.
Okay, so one is, and that's actually not a surprising one, but that's a key one, is throughout the entire Mississippi River Basin, any sort of urban, suburban, exurban, small town development, but where you have land development, you have runoff, and you have hold on, just let me finish with this at first, and then if you've got something else, we'll come back to that. But you have you've got several things that are happening. First of all, development means what we call impervious cover, impervious surface. So that's buildings, that's roads, that's sidewalks. It's even hard packed dirt and so forth, where the water can't filter into the soil and so forth. And so all that means the water's running off of those, okay? So every time it rains out on your driveway or in the street, that water is eventually ending up in the Mississippi River at some point, right? I mean, eventually that will carry with it various kinds of pollutants. So then what else is going on? Okay, we're fertilizing that too, right? I mean, how many people fertilize their lawns? Right? Okay, and you can be sure that any commercial enterprise, right? I mean, how do you think the lawn in the Oval looks green all the time, right? Okay, so you're like, well, Professor Arnold, your lectures probably fertilize that, right? No, but no, I mean, right? I mean, so no, it's right. It's being fertilized, right? Okay, right? Of course. Okay, so now that's there's some stuff going on there where it filters down into the soil, but anyway, but all that kind of landscaping. So it doesn't just have to be residences. Okay, just hold on. Let me residences. And mostly residences, some other kinds of activities also have human waste, and they have pet waste, right? So, every time your dog poops in your yard and then there's a rain and you haven't cleaned it up, okay, eventually that's going to end up in the Mississippi River, eventually, right? Some part of that will, right, because it's going to end up eventually in the Ohio, and then eventually end up in the Mississippi and so forth, right? Human waste, okay, what do we have? Where's that coming from? Okay, hopefully not your lawn, okay? Okay, some of you, I don't know, but anyway, but hopefully not your lawn. Where's it coming from?
Wastewater treatment.
Right, yes, it's coming from our sewer systems, wastewater treatment systems, okay? So a couple of different sources. One is the actual wastewater facility, so the sewer treatment plants, okay? So they treat it, they clean it up, but they're not eliminating all of the nutrients, okay? So there's still some nitrogen and phosphorus and so forth that's in in the what they discharge into waters. Moreover, there's what's called combined sewer overflows, okay? So in the inner part of Louisville, basically mostly within the Watterson, except a few parts of Windy Hill. So mostly Watterson, within the Watterson, the storm water system, so that's the stuff where the water runs into the street and then down the drains, in the streets, so forth. Okay, so that's storm water runoff. And the sewer systems are combined. And when you have a heavy rainfall, okay, the system, there's too much water going into it for it to hold all that, okay? And there are two options. One option is if we close those systems, all that's gonna come up through your toilets and your sinks and so forth. Not good, right? Okay, drains and so forth, okay? So the other thing is, what happens is that there are valves that open up and that stuff gets released into our waterways, okay? It's released into Beargrass Creek, it gets released into the Ohio River, and so that is, during a heavy storm event, raw sewage that is going into our waterways, which is nutrients, okay? So let me start with April and then
I
for the
was
Vickers.
just gonna take a guess at what the surprising one was. I was thinking maybe you were talking about the golf courses. I don't know.
Okay, golf courses also fertilized, yep, part of the landscaping.
So I was gonna say, when we were on the field study in Beargrass Creek, there was a big discussion with both of our presenters on actually who caused the most pollution. And one said that it was from urbanization and the fact that homeowners don't know how much fertilizer to actually use on their land.
Okay.
And so they're just gonna dump the bag and not waste it, whereas agricultural practices, they're gonna try to be the most economical and they are gonna have it down to a science exactly what fertilizer they need on their land, so it won't run off.
Okay, good.
So that was the discussion on who actually
Right.
is the worst polluter to
Okay.
waterways.
Well, if farming is done right, you also have sort of buffer zones where then any fertilizer runoff can actually filter into to a vegetated area and as opposed to going into the waterway. Whereas here, it just picks up speed once it gets into the streets and gutters and so forth and keeps going. Okay, so that's okay. The surprising one for Floyd's Fork, which is going to eventually end up in the Ohio River. It's going to be in the Salt River and then the Ohio River and then the Mississippi River and so forth. But it is actually deer population. So it's actually attributed to forest, but what it is it's areas that are around developed areas, but still have a substantial amount of wildlife, but we have an overpopulation, right? Why? Well, we can't hunt them because you can't go out to Oldham County and just get your gun out and start shooting at the deer and you accidentally hit your neighbor instead, right? That's not right. So what's happened is we have these sort of these areas with a lot of wildlife and vegetation, but they're overpopulated because they don't have the natural predators. They don't have hunting and other things that happen and so forth. And so we end up actually with a fair amount of waste from wildlife. From overpopulated wildlife in certain areas. Now that's certain areas. Don't get carried away. Okay, it's not a big, huge source in Beargrass Creek. And if you go further out, you get more in the way of natural predators, and it's more spread out and so forth. And so it's not. But that can happen in some places. All right. What else? What else is going on with all of this? Another problem with farming has to do with tilling practices. Okay, so the tilling practices, the way in which the soil is cultivated and planting and so forth, can end up leading to soil erosion, and it can lead to nutrient runoff. So one of the things is, while it is absolutely true that farmers are not going to be putting more fertilizer than they absolutely need. If, however, they don't have any cover crops in the winter time frame, you've got the wind and the snow and the ice and so on and so forth, rain, etc., that is leading to soil erosion because you have uncovered fields, and you're also getting nutrient runoff going in that. So one of the sort of techniques that extension services help with, and NRCS and so forth, is how to help farmers put cover crops in the winter that actually help. And it helps the farmers because it helps preserve the soil and the richness of the soil. Okay. Other things that are going on. Well, as I pointed out earlier, that one of the challenges is a lot of different kinds of agricultural practices of different scales. Some very large scale, some small scale, right? So that's another thing. Okay. Yeah.
I guess maybe in if you zoom way out, then climate change is affecting all of these farms, which is affecting also the land around the farms. So the relationship that the built structure has with the natural environment, since that's out of sync too, with all of the world getting hotter and all of these other things that affect what the farm is actually supposed to do, they kind of reify the problems and the problem gets bigger.
Okay, good. So let's think about two different aspects of climate change. There are lots of different aspects. Let's think about two. One is what happens when the Gulf of Mexico is hotter, or the water in the Mississippi River is hotter because temperatures have increased, right? Okay, so if that happens, you're going to get more algae bloom. You're going to get it sooner, right? It's going to be, right, the problem is going to amplify by several magnitudes, right? It's going to be a much bigger problem because the warmth of all this causes it to grow fast, grow soon. Okay. Secondly, what happens if it's wetter? Okay, if it's wetter, what that means is that you get these unexpected rain events where, let's assume for a moment that you have the fiscally responsible and environmentally responsible farmer who's only applying so much fertilizer to the field, saying, hey, I don't want to spend more, I don't want to have more, but now it's running off in ways that the farmer didn't anticipate, because who anticipated that you're going to have a 1,000-year flood, every 5 years now? Because again, we've changed what's happening has changed dramatically. So that's another problem with all this. And so all those sort of things we talk about, unprecedented surprises and that disturbances to systems, all that is relevant. What about some of the social, political, economic context of all this?
Farm Bureau believes that the farmers are being picked on unfairly, that they're kind of an easy target compared to, telling all these suburban and urban populations that they need to take care of their runoff.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, and it's true, right? I mean, at some level, it is so much easier to regulate a concentrated economic producer than it is to regulate a diffuse residential population, right? Okay. So how do we get control over air emissions from vehicles, right? You were not told you can only drive so much, right? You're not limited in that way. Instead, what happens is we regulate the auto manufacturers to put in emission controls, right? The government can do that so much more easily, right? And so this, this comes up in a lot of ways. It comes up in issues having to do with water conservation. So out west, where water is scarce, it is always a challenge for the water regulators to get regular everyday people who are used to watering their Kentucky bluegrass in the desert to cut back on their water consumption, right? So actually, again, how do they do it? They mostly put the pressure on the water providers, who then in turn effectuate change through pricing, right? So now it becomes costly for you to water your bluegrass in the desert and that kind of thing. But that's key. What else going on politically, socially? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, currently the Trump administration has not been super helpful in pushing environmental regulations.
Okay, so we have this sort of pullback from environmental regulation, from the idea that we should be regulating, that regulation should be imposing cost on producers and contributors to economic growth and development. So absolutely, that's going to be a part of this. If you are the Kentucky Farm Bureau, now is obviously a better time to champion your cause than maybe 6 years ago would have been, right? Okay, so that's one aspect of this. What else? Well, one of the things that comes with that, though, is a fair amount of uncertainty about how we're going to address these problems, right? Okay, so the nutrient runoff, the sediment deposition in our waterways and our wetlands, they're big problems that lots of people have to experience. And the federal government has to deal with it. There are costs involved. There are lots of industries that have to deal with the costs. There are lots of people who have to deal. And so one of the challenges is to look at what's going on right now. There are public health warnings about algae blooms in the Ohio River, right? Pull up the news, right? It's happening right now, which have some health risk from the toxins that can come off these algae blooms in the air, right? You certainly don't want to go swimming in, right? So I hope everybody who went canoeing the other day stayed out of the water, and right. Good. Glad to hear it, and so forth. But it's it's an issue. So what I'm saying is that the problems don't go away. One of the things that's happening is we're going to talk about the pullback on the scope of federal jurisdiction over waters. Okay, so the Waters of the United States rule, known as WOTUS, which that was adopted by the Obama administration, has been invalidated by a federal court and then either withdrawn or is in the process of being withdrawn by the Trump administration, which is going to mean very likely that the number of wetlands that are subject to federal control, federal regulation, is going to be substantially less, or at least somewhat less. And then the question is, what are we going to do about those wetlands that aren't subject to federal regulation? Okay, it's not the case that they are just totally unregulated. The question is, are they subject to state regulation, local regulation? Are there ways to protect them, to conserve them, that don't involve statutes and regulations? So for example, what could the Nature Conservancy do? What could collaborative, multi-stakeholder solutions produce? So those are some things to think about. So the point I want to make here is it's not just a question of whether your client will oppose and sue over the EPA potentially setting nutrient limits for the Ohio River. Okay, that's going to be one of the issues. Not for the Ohio River, for the Mississippi River Basin. Okay, that's going to be one of the issues, right? You saw that, you saw the lawsuit over that, and so on and so forth. But it's also going to be, what kinds of solutions will your client be a part of, and what will that look like? How will it be structured? Okay, so you want to think through some of those issues. All right, so we have sort of the basics. Now we have fall break on Monday, right? Sorry, I will not see you on Monday. But then when we come back, don't get carried away yet. Hold on. When we come back, we're going to dive, fast out of the gate into the Clean Water Act. Okay, so this is a bigger statute than endangered species or NEPA in terms of the amount of law. So we're going to get going on that. So read up on it.